Hello and welcome. We are continuing to read Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies. This is the author's note. Author's note vocabulary. Number 1, fictional. Made up, invented by the imagination. Number 2, critical. Having a decisive or crucial importance in the success, failure, or existence of something. Number 3, engaged, recruited. Number 4, intention, an aim or plan. Number 5, inquiry, an act of asking for information. Number 6, procuring, obtaining something, especially with care or effort. Number 7, relaying, receiving and passing on. Number 8, intelligence, military or political information. Number 9, miserable, of a situation or environment causing someone to feel wretchedly unhappy or uncomfortable. Number 10, brutal, punishingly hard or uncomfortable. Number 11, exposure, a physical condition resulting from being outside in severe weather conditions without adequate protection. Number 12, noble, of imposing or magnificent size or appearance. Number 13, inoculated, immunize someone against a disease by introducing infective material, microorganisms, or vaccine into the body. Number 14, vaccine, a substance used to stimulate immunity to a particular infectious disease or pathogen, typically prepared from an inactivated or weakened form of the causative agent or from its constituents or products. Number 15, inconveniences, troubles or difficulties caused to one's personal requirements or comfort. Number 16, disadvantages, unfavorable circumstances or conditions that reduce the chances of success or effectiveness. Number 17, necessity, a state of things or circumstances enforcing a certain course. Number 18, authorizes, gives official permission for or approval to an undertaking or agent. Number 19, measure, a plan or course of action taken to achieve a particular purpose. Number 20, virulence, the severity or harmfulness of a disease or poison. Number 21, dread, anticipate with great apprehension or fear. Number 22, controversial, the subject of intense public argument, disagreement, or disapproval. 23, recruitment, the action of enlisting new people in the armed forces. Number 24, enlisted, enrolled in the armed forces. Number 25, racism, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Number 26, plantation, an estate on which crops such as coffee, sugar, and tobacco are cultivated by resident labor. Number 27, treaty, a formally concluded and ratified agreement between countries. Number 28, property, a thing or things belonging to someone, possessions collectively. Number 29, evacuated, removed someone from a place of danger to a safer place. If you open your book to the section titled Author's Note, we'll continue from there. Isaac Pope is a fictional character, but his story is based on the experiences of real soldiers who served in Colonel John Glover's 14th Continental Regiment. They were called the Marblehead Mariners because nearly all of them had served on fishing boats together, based in the town of Marblehead, Massachusetts. The 14th Continental Regiment included a number of African American and Native soldiers, and they really did sneak George Washington's army across the East River in the middle of the night to escape from the Redcoats after the Battle of Long Island. In less than 9 hours, they ferried almost 9,000 men across the river. From there, the Marblehead Mariners fought in several more battles in New York and retreated through New Jersey. They arrived at Washington's camp in Pennsylvania just days before he launched the Christmas night raid on Trenton. That effort may well have been impossible without Glover's mariners to man the boats and without the Continental Army spies who supplied Washington with critical information necessary to carry out the attack. The officer who gave Isaac his spying mission is fictional, but the letter from General Washington was real. In December of 1776, Washington wrote to his officers and asked them to look for men who might be helpful as spies. They were asked to find, and this is in quotation marks, some person who can be engaged to cross the river as a spy, that we may, if possible, obtain some knowledge of the enemy's situation, movements, and intention. Particular inquiry should be made by the person sent, if any preparations are making to cross the river, whether any boats are building and where, whether they are coming overland from Brunswick, whether any great collection of horses is made, and for what purpose. Expense must not be spared in procuring such intelligence, and it will readily be paid by me. Unquote. Isaac Pope's spy mission was inspired by the stories of real-life spies who worked for the Continental Army. James Armistead was an enslaved man who joined the Continental Army in 1781 and served under the Marquis de Lafayette, the commander of the French forces who had come to help the Continental Army. Armistead posed as a runaway slave who had been hired by the British to spy on the Americans, and British General Cornwallis welcomed him into his camp. Armistead went back and forth from there to the American forces, relaying information that ultimately helped the Continental Army win the Battle of Yorktown, which ended the war. Washington reportedly had at least one spy who studied the roads and terrain around Trenton and reported back to him about that and about the number of Hessian troops there. Historians believe this intelligence helped him to plan the Christmas night attack. Interestingly enough, Rawle also got important information from spies just before the attack on Trenton. Two brothers who had remained loyal to England, Abraham and Moses Duane, apparently saw Washington's troops preparing for the crossing. They hurried to tell Rawle, but he was at a party and refused to be interrupted, so his servants wouldn't let the brothers in. The brothers wrote a note instead, and when the servant delivered it, Rawle was busy playing cards and shoved it into his pocket instead of reading it. When Christmas night arrived, men like Isaac really did man the boats that moved Washington's entire army across the Delaware River, and the weather was every bit as miserable as it's described in this story. John Greenwood, a fifer from Boston, described the brutal weather that night, and this is in quotes. Over the river we then went in a flat-bottomed scow, and we had to wait for the rest, and so began to pull down fences and make fires to warm ourselves, for the storm was increasing rapidly. After a while it rained, hailed, snowed, and froze, and at the same time blew a perfect hurricane. This is unquote now. Today, the site of the crossing of the Delaware is a state park with a museum that shares the story of the 14th Continental Regiment's role in the attack on Trenton. After the crossing was complete, the Battle of Trenton itself only lasted a couple of hours. Washington didn't lose any men to enemy bullets during the battle, though several did die from exposure in that awful weather. 22 Hessians were killed, and many more were taken prisoner. A famous painting that depicts this historic river crossing hangs in New York City's Metropolitan Museum of Art, but historians are quick to point out that this particular piece is more art than history. It was painted by a German artist named Emanuel Letz more than 70 years after the battle. The Delaware River doesn't look like this at the point where Washington's army crossed. It's likely that Letz actually painted the Rhine, a river in his homeland, to portray it instead. The boats shown in the painting aren't the Durham boats that were actually used that night. Those were larger, carried 40 men, and had higher sides. Finally, given the stormy conditions and swirling ice chunks that came careening down the river, George Washington's noble stance in the painting is quite a stretch as well. If he'd been standing like that on the night of the crossing, he'd almost certainly have toppled right into the icy river. And that flag shown in the boat, it wasn't around yet on the night they crossed the river. That version of the American flag didn't exist until 1777. Isaac's battle with smallpox was also based on historic accounts of disease during this time period. In the early days of the American Revolution, far more members of the Continental Army died from diseases than from battle. Smallpox turned out to be more dangerous than the enemy's bullets or bayonets. George Washington had smallpox himself when he was a teenager, so he knew of its horrors, and he realized that it was threatening to wipe out his army. Finally, he made the decision to have all his troops inoculated or given vaccines. In February 1777, Washington wrote, and this is in quotation marks, "Finding the smallpox to be spreading much and fearing that no precaution can prevent it from running through the whole of our army, I have determined that the troops shall be inoculated. This expedient may be attended with some inconveniences and some disadvantages, but yet I trust in its consequences will have the most happy effect. Necessity not only authorizes, but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army in the natural way and rage with its usual virulence, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy." Unquote. Washington's decision was controversial at the time. Many people were still afraid of the vaccine, but ultimately historians agree that it probably saved his army. Isaac and Joe are fictional characters, but they were inspired by more than 5,000 African American men, both free and enslaved, who served with the Patriots at some point during the Revolutionary War. These men fought with no promise of freedom, and most of them found themselves enslaved again when the war ended. Isaac's reflections on George Washington's policy toward black soldiers are based on historical facts. When Washington took command of the Continental Army in 1775, he ordered an end to the recruitment of black soldiers, whether those men were free or enslaved. Those who were already enlisted in the North, many of whom fought bravely at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, were only allowed to finish their terms of service. What was behind this racism? Washington was from Virginia, and plantation owners in the South worried that arming African American men could result in slave uprisings. They feared that more than they feared the British Army. But Washington's policy didn't last. In 1775, the British Army started actively recruiting enslaved men, promising them freedom as long as they'd run away from the Patriots and not loyalists. Within a month, 800 men had joined the unit known as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. This forced the Continental Army to change its policy. In January 1776, Washington allowed free black men with prior military experience to enlist, and that offer was extended to all free black men in 1777. Soon after, Washington approved a plan for Rhode Island to raise a regiment of free blacks and enslaved men. What happened to the enslaved people who fought with the British in the Revolutionary War? Many were captured and forced back into slavery after the Battle of Yorktown. Others escaped to New York. In 1782, American and British officials signed the treaty that granted Americans independence. As part of that deal, Americans demanded the return of their property, including enslaved men who had run away to fight with the British. Britain's officers said no. They created a list of the African Americans who had served Britain in the war and made arrangements for some of them to be evacuated. Ultimately, 3,000 to 4,000 African American people boarded ships in New York and left for Nova Scotia, as well as Britain and Jamaica. Unfortunately, those who ended up in Nova Scotia didn't find a much better living situation there. Many became indentured servants, working under terrible conditions with few rights in a cold place far from home. As for the enslaved men who fought for the Continental Army, a few were freed when the war ended. Most, however, were still considered property. They were sent back into slavery by the country they'd helped to found and never tasted the freedom for which they'd fought. Authors note comprehension questions. Number 1. The author Kate Mesner tells us that Isaac Pope is a fictional character. What does this mean? Sample answer. The fact that Isaac Pope is a fictional character means that he is a person Kate Mesner simply made up. He was not a real person who participated in the Battle of Trenton. Question number 2. Why do you think the author used the fictional character Isaac Pope to tell this story? Sample answer. I think the author used a fictional character to tell this story because she wanted to have her readers understand these parts of the American Revolutionary War from the perspective of a young enslaved black man. Using Isaac as a fictional character allowed Kate Mesner to do this. Question 3. Besides colonists from Europe, what 2 other groups made up the 14th Continental Regiment? Sample answer. The author tells us that colonists from Europe, along with African Americans and Native Americans, made up the 14th Continental Regiment. Question 4. What were 2 things the 14th Continental Regiment from Marblehead, Massachusetts did during the Revolutionary War to help ensure a victory for the Americans? Sample answer. The 14th Continental Regiment from Marblehead, Massachusetts helped sneak George Washington's army across the East River in the middle of the night to escape from the British after the Battle of Long Island. They also helped Washington's army cross the Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to fight in the Battle of Trenton. These efforts of the 14th Continental Regiment helped ensure a victory for the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Question 5. What were 2 things George Washington learned about the enemy from spies during the Revolutionary War? Sample answer. In preparation for the Battle of Trenton, George Washington used spies to learn about the terrain his troops would have to cover to get to Trenton, as well as about the number of Hessian troops he and his men would have to face in the battle. Question 6. Who was James Armistead, and how did he help the Continental Army win the Battle of Yorktown that ended the Revolutionary War? Sample answer. James Armistead was an enslaved man who joined the Continental Army in 1781. Armistead served as a spy. He spied on British General Cornwallis and his men at Yorktown. The information he gathered about the British forces there helped the Americans win the Battle of Yorktown, which ended the Revolutionary War. Question 7. British Colonel Rall also enlisted spies during the Revolutionary War. Why didn't this fact help his forces win the Battle of Trenton? Sample answer. Colonel Rall, like George Washington, enlisted spies during the Revolutionary War, but this didn't help him during the Battle of Trenton because he never heard the oral report from his spies, nor did he read their written report. Colonel Rall did not want to be interrupted with a face-to-face meeting with his spies while he was at a party. Later that night, he stuffed a note from his spies into his pocket without reading it because he was playing cards. Question 8. Besides battle wounds, what were 2 other things that led to the deaths of those fighting on the American side during the Revolutionary War? Sample answer. Besides battle wounds, 2 other things that led to the deaths of those fighting on the American side during the Revolutionary War were exposure, a physical condition resulting from being outside in severe weather conditions without adequate protection, and disease, especially smallpox. Question 9. Even though George Washington was fighting for freedom from British rule, we know he wasn't initially in favor of having freed or enslaved the blacks fighting on the American side. Why do you think Washington took this position? Sample answer. It is likely that Washington thought arming freed or enslaved blacks during the war might lead to these blacks fighting for freedom for all blacks in America after the Revolutionary War. Neither Washington himself nor many of the other white leaders in America in the late 1700s were willing to allow this to happen. Question number 10. During the Revolutionary War, the British offered freedom to black men who fought for Britain in this war. In what ways did the British make good on their promise after the war ended? Sample answer. According to the authors, and this is in quotes, they, the British, created a list of the African Americans who had served Britain in the war and made arrangements for some of them to be evacuated. This means the British helped some African Americans get out of America after the war ended. Some of these African Americans went to Nova Scotia, others to Britain, and still others went to Jamaica. And this takes us to the end of the book.